I begged my family to never speak to me again, so my psychotic fiancé would leave them alone, but he showed up at my father's house anyway. And this time, my brothers weren't bluffing. Gravel crunched under tires at 4:12 on a Saturday afternoon. I was drying a coffee mug when I heard it. My hand stopped moving. Nobody came up that driveway without calling first. Not anymore. I looked out the kitchen window and my stomach dropped through the floor. A silver rental car. A man stepping out of it who used to be beautiful to me. Now his cheeks were hollow. His jaw was covered in 3 days of stubble. He wore the same gray peacoat he'd worn on our first date, and it hung off him wrong, like he'd lost 20 pounds since the last time I'd seen him. Damien. He walked toward my father's front door like he already owned it. Dad! My voice came out cracked and high, nothing like my own. Dad, he's here! Wade and Tyler came sprinting around the side of the house, sawdust still clinging to Wade's work gloves. My mother grabbed my niece and nephew off the living room floor and ran for the stairs, already dialing 911, already choking out our address to a dispatcher in a voice I'd never heard her use. Damien pounded on the door with both fists. I just want to talk, he shouted. I love her. You people poisoned her against me. Titan lost his mind at the door, snarling, snapping, throwing his whole 100-pound body against the wood. My father had to grab his collar with both hands to hold him back. Then my father looked at me, one question in his eyes. Wait for the police or handle this ourselves right now? I nodded. He reached for the pistol on the shelf by the door. Wade already had his 9mm in his hand. Tyler pulled the shotgun down off the rack in the hallway, the same rack that used to hold nothing but a fishing rod and a broom. The three of them stepped out onto that porch together. 3 barrels rose to meet the man who had once told me, in explicit and calm detail, exactly how he was going to end my entire family. She's not your fiancé anymore, Tyler said, and you are violating a restraining order right now. Damien's face did something I recognized, the mask cracking. Underneath it, something with no bottom. You poisoned her against me, he said. She's mine. She will always be mine. His hand disappeared inside his jacket. Every gun on that porch came up at once, and for 3 full seconds, nobody standing there was breathing. Nobody except him. To understand how 3 armed men ended up on my father's porch aiming at a man I'd once agreed to marry, you have to go back 2.5 years, to a wine bar in the short north called Vine and Table, on a Thursday night in March, when I was 24 years old and still believed that the right man could make you feel like you'd finally been found. I'm Sienna. I'm 27 now. At the time, I was a dental hygienist at a practice on High Street, 3 years out of school, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment in Clintonville with my college roommate, Marin. My life was small and unremarkable, and looking back, it was mine. That matters. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what I let get taken from me. Damien Cole was 31 when we met. An insurance claims adjuster for a mid-size firm downtown, the kind of job that came with a company Audi and an expense account and a story for every occasion. He was funny in that specific way that makes a room lean toward him. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk and 1 raw sugar after hearing me order it exactly once. He opened every door. He called me beautiful in front of strangers at the bar, loud enough that the bartender smiled at me like I'd won something. I thought I had. The first 4 months were, if I'm honest with myself now, the best 4 months of my adult life. He took me to dinner at Marcella's on our 1-month anniversary and told the waiter it was a special occasion before I'd even sat down. He drove 2 hours to Chillicothe with me to meet my parents in May, shook my father's hand, called my mother ma'am, admired my father's workshop and the rocking chair he was restoring for my cousin's baby. Wade liked him. Tyler liked him more. For a while, everyone did. The first crack came in July, 4 months in, at a bar called The Standard near campus. A man at the counter, a stranger, asked me for directions to a parking garage. That's it. Directions. I pointed. He thanked me. He left. Damien didn't say a single word the rest of the night. He didn't say anything in the car either. Not until we were inside his apartment, door locked behind us. And then he threw his keys across the room hard enough to put a dent in the drywall and put his fist straight through it 6 inches from my head. He cried after. Actually cried. Sitting on the kitchen floor with his knees pulled up. Saying his father used to hit his mother. Saying he swore to God he'd never be that man. Saying he just loved me so much it scared him sometimes. I believed him. I held him on that kitchen floor and told him it was okay. And that was, I understand now, the first mistake in a very long line of mistakes I made, because I mistook fear for love and didn't yet know the difference. There was one more thing from that early period I didn't think about again until much later. Somewhere around month 6, half a bottle of wine into a Friday night, I asked him about his last relationship. His face changed instantly, that particular flatness dropping over it like a shade. Kayla, he said, like the name tasted bad. She was unstable, made things up about me to get attention. I don't really talk about it. I didn't push. I filed it under things I didn't need to know and moved on, the way you do when you're 24 and in love and looking for reasons to keep going rather than reasons to stop. The hitting started on our 1-year anniversary at a restaurant in German Village. A waiter smiled at me while refilling my water. Too friendly, apparently. In the parking garage afterward, Damien backhanded me so hard I saw white stars at the edges of my vision and had to grab the hood of a stranger's car to stay upright. Then came the apology. The flowers delivered to my work the next morning, $40 worth of tulips with a card that said, "I don't deserve you, I'm getting help, I promise." Then, 3 weeks later, it happened again. I learned to cover bruises with concealer 2 shades too light. I learned to say I'd walked into a cabinet door, that I'd tripped on the stairs at my apartment, that I was clumsy, always had been. Ask my mother. I got good at lying. Too good. I stopped recognizing the woman doing it in the mirror some mornings, and I told myself that was just what your late 20s were supposed to feel like. He isolated me carefully, and in hindsight, methodically. Maren went first. He told me she was jealous of us, that she made comments when he wasn't around, that a real friend wouldn't ask so many questions about our relationship. I stopped answering her texts by the end of that year. She stopped sending them somewhere around Christmas. I don't blame her. I would have given up on me too. My family went next, and that one hurt worse because it happened so slowly I couldn't point to the day it finished. Every visit to Chillicothe came with a fight beforehand about timing, or an argument during about how much attention I was paying to my brothers instead of him, or a punishment after in the form of 2 days of silence so total it felt like living with a ghost. Eventually, it was easier to just stop going. I told my mother I was busy with work. I told my father the drive was hard on my car. I told everyone a version of the truth small enough to swallow, and I told myself I was protecting them by staying away, when really I was protecting him from ever having to answer for what he was doing to me in a house he didn't control. He proposed in November, at Marcella's again, at the same table where we'd celebrated our 1-month anniversary 2 years earlier. And I said yes with my heart hammering somewhere up near my throat, because by then I understood, in the specific wordless way you understand weather coming, that saying no would cost me more than saying yes ever would. That's who I was. And that's the man I'd agreed to marry when everything finally broke apart 9 weeks before our wedding date. The escalation didn't happen all at once. It happened in stages, each one worse than the last, each one absorbed and normalized until the next one arrived to replace it as the new worst thing that had ever happened to me. The first stage was money. Damien earned more than I did, and after the engagement, he suggested, reasonably at first, that we combine our finances to save for the wedding and the house we'd eventually buy. I agreed. We opened a joint account at Huntington Bank in January with $1,400 in it, most of it mine. 3 years of careful saving from a girl who used to clip coupons out of the Sunday paper with her mother. Within 2 months, my paycheck was auto-depositing into that account, and Damien was the only one with the debit card. He gave me $200 a week in cash, called it my spending money, and asked for receipts. I told myself this was normal. Couples merge finances. I told myself this while standing in a Kroger parking lot, counting out exact change for groceries, doing math in my head so I wouldn't go over $200 and have to explain the overage. The second stage was surveillance dressed up as intimacy. He installed a tracking app on my phone in February, framed as a safety feature, something any loving fiancé would want, so he'd always know I got to work okay. He wanted my Instagram password so we could be on the same page about who I followed. He read my texts openly now, no longer hiding it, scrolling through my phone at dinner while I sat across from him and said nothing, because saying something had a cost I'd learned to calculate in advance. The third stage was the threats dressed up as love. If I so much as mentioned wanting a night out with a coworker, he'd go quiet, then say something like, "I don't know what I'd do if you left." I mean that. I don't know what I'd do. The first time he said it, I spent 40 minutes talking him down from what sounded like a threat to hurt himself, sitting on our bathroom floor holding both his hands, terrified I'd caused something I couldn't fix. By the 10th time, I understood it wasn't about his safety. It was a leash, and I was the one wearing it. And every time I tried to leave the yard, he only had to tug once. The fourth stage was the isolation completing itself. My mother called in March, worried, saying it had been 4 months since I'd been home. Damien stood in the doorway of our bedroom while I took the call, arms crossed, and I found myself telling her I was slammed at work, that I'd try to come for Easter, that everything was fine, wonderful actually, while he watched my face for any wrong word like a man grading a test. I want to tell you I saw where this was going. I didn't, not clearly, not until the fifth stage arrived and took the choice away from me entirely. It happened on a Tuesday night in April. Damien was scrolling my phone at the kitchen table, something he did most nights by then, and he found a text from Maren, sent months earlier, that I'd forgotten was even still in my inbox. 4 words. "You deserve better, Sienna." He didn't yell. That was the part that still wakes me up sometimes. He went completely silent, set the phone down very carefully on the table, and then he was across the kitchen with his hand around my throat and my back against the refrigerator before I'd even registered him standing up. "If you ever leave me," he said, in a voice so calm it was almost conversational, "I will kill your whole family. I will start with your father. I will make you watch every single one of them go, and then I'll save you for last." He described it, the order he'd do it in, where he'd hide what was left. His eyes were empty while he said it, like a man reading a grocery list out loud, and that emptiness scared me more than the hand still closed around my throat. Somewhere in the middle of it, I noticed something small and strange that I didn't have room to think about at the time. He mentioned, almost as an aside, almost like a boast, that he'd learned a few things the last time someone tried to leave him, that people always think they can just disappear, that they're always wrong. I filed it away the same way I'd filed away the name Kayla 2 years earlier, because I was fighting to breathe, and that was as much attention as I had left to give anything. He let go eventually. I locked myself in the bathroom, and with my hands shaking so badly I dropped the phone twice, I called the police. They arrested him that night on an assault charge. I filed for a civil protection order the following week. A judge granted it, and I told myself the piece of paper meant something close to safety. I was wrong, and it took less than a month to find out exactly how wrong. He started showing up outside the dental practice, parked across the street in a car I didn't recognize, always gone by the time I called the police, always just far enough away to stay technically legal. Outside my new apartment, the one I'd moved into alone with Marin's help, standing under the streetlight at the corner for 20 minutes at a time before walking off. He never came close enough to violate the order in a way anyone could prove. He just wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to feel it, the way you feel a draft in a house you thought was sealed. So I packed one suitcase, took my late grandmother Eleanor's ring off the dresser where I'd left his engagement ring behind, and I drove the 2 hours to my father's house outside Chillicothe because I couldn't think of anywhere else in the world that still felt like it belonged to me. My family turned that house into a fortress within a week, and it should tell you something about what kind of family I have that not one of them hesitated. My father, Frank, is 58, a Marine for 11 years before he came home and spent the next 3 decades running a small engine repair shop out of Chillicothe. He put motion sensor lights up around the entire perimeter of the property himself, ran the wiring in a single weekend, cursing the whole time about how it should have taken half as long. My brother Wade, 30, a contractor by trade, installed 4 cameras covering every angle of the house and synced them to an app on all our phones. Tyler, 25, who works at my father's shop, brought Titan over from his own place, a 100-pound German Shepherd mix who'd bark himself hoarse at a leaf blowing across the porch. My father taught me to shoot when I was 16, out behind the shop on cans lined up on a fence post, a skill I'd never once expected to need for anything but deer season. Now Wade and Tyler strapped on their own pistols every night before bed, like it was a normal part of getting ready to sleep, like this was simply what our family did now. And none of us said out loud how strange that was, because saying it out loud would have meant admitting how frightened we all actually were. Weeks passed with no sign of him, just texts, sent from numbers that changed every time, full of details only someone watching the house could possibly know. The crack running through our driveway concrete, the specific yellow of my mother's gardening gloves, a photograph, one afternoon, of my father's truck taken from somewhere in our own front yard, the angle low, like it had been shot from behind the tree line. He was learning our patterns, waiting for the day we let our guard down even an inch. I begged my family, more than once, to tell everyone in town that I was gone for good, moved away, out of the picture entirely, thinking it might make him lose interest and finally leave them alone, even if he never left me alone. I told my father I would go stay with a cousin in another state if it meant keeping the rest of them safe. I meant it. I would have disappeared from my own life if I thought it would work. It didn't work, because it was never really about me leaving. It was about making sure I understood I could never truly be gone. He didn't want me back. He wanted me afraid, forever, in a way that would follow me into every room for the rest of my life. One Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into staying at my father's, Titan started barking at the tree line along the eastern fence and wouldn't stop. He did it every night after that around the same time, 7:30, throwing himself against the fence toward a patch of oak trees that had nothing in it as far as any of us could see. Wade walked the fence line twice with a flashlight and found nothing. My father chalked it up to a raccoon denning somewhere in the brush. I noted it, the same reflexive filing away I'd been doing for 2 years, and moved on, because there was always something more urgent demanding my attention. It would turn out to matter more than any of us could have imagined. 2 nights later, Wade decided he'd had enough of guessing. It was almost 8 o'clock, dark already, mid-April, cold enough that his breath fogged in front of the flashlight beam. He told my father he was going to walk the whole tree line properly this time, foot by foot, instead of just scanning it from the fence. My father wanted to go with him. Wade told him to stay on the porch with the rifle instead, in case this was exactly the kind of distraction meant to pull 2 grown men away from the house at once. That was the kind of thinking we'd all learned to do by then. Nothing was ever just what it looked like anymore. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his flashlight bob through the dark for almost 15 minutes. Titan strained against Tyler's grip on the porch, whining low in his throat, refusing to stop staring at the same cluster of oaks he'd been barking at for 3 weeks straight. My mother stood next to me with a dish towel twisted so tight in her hands the knuckles had gone white. Neither of us said anything. We'd learned that talking about the fear out loud never made it smaller. It only gave it a shape. Wade's light stopped moving. Dad, his voice carried across the yard, tight and strange. Dad, come here, bring the big flashlight. My father was off the porch before Wade finished the sentence. Tyler right behind him, Titan straining so hard against his collar that Tyler nearly lost his footing in the wet grass. I grabbed my mother's coat off the hook without thinking and went out after them, because staying inside not knowing had become, somewhere over the last 2 months, worse than whatever was actually happening outside. By the time I reached the tree line, all 3 of them were crouched around the base of a wide oak about 40 yards past our fence, technically on the neighbor's unfarmed land, but close enough to our property that the angle made my skin crawl the second I understood what I was looking at. A small black box, roughly the size of a paperback novel, zip-tied to the trunk about 5 feet off the ground, camouflaged with strips of green and brown fabric wrapped loosely around the housing. A single dark lens, no bigger than a dime, aimed directly at the back corner of my father's house, at the kitchen window, at the exact spot where my mother and I had been standing 15 minutes earlier, twisting a dish towel into knots. It's a trail camera, Wade said quietly. Hunters use them to track deer patterns. This one's not for deer. Nobody spoke for a moment. Titan had finally gone quiet, sitting rigid at Tyler's side, ears up, still watching the box like it might move. How long? My father said. It wasn't really a question. His voice had dropped into a register register I'd only heard him use twice in my life. Once when Wade broke his arm falling off the shop roof at 19. Once the week I first told him what Damien had done to me. A voice with no room left in it for anything but controlled fury. No idea, Wade said. Card looks full though. It's been running a while. My hands were shaking by the time Wade carefully cut the zip tie with his pocket knife and carried the camera back to the house like it was something that might detonate. We set it on the kitchen table, all four of us standing around it, and for a long moment, nobody moved to touch it again. We shouldn't open it, Tyler said. We should call the detective, chain of evidence, or whatever they call it. If we mess with it, maybe it doesn't count for anything. He was right, and it was the kind of clear thinking none of the rest of us had left in us right then. My father called Sergeant Alvarez, the detective who'd been assigned to the restraining order violations since the second week I'd moved in, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a slow, deliberate way of talking that had made me trust him almost against my will the first time we met. He picked up on the second ring. My father explained what we'd found in short, clipped sentences, and I watched his jaw work while he listened to whatever Alvarez said back. He's coming out tonight, my father said, hanging up. Said don't touch anything else. Said this changes some things. Those 4 words sat in the kitchen with us for the 40 minutes it took Alvarez to make the drive out from town. Changes some things. None of us asked him to clarify over the phone what he meant, and I think that was because some part of every one of us already suspected the answer wouldn't be small. Alvarez arrived a little after 9, alone, in an unmarked sedan that Titan barked at anyway until Tyler hushed him. He was gentle taking the camera from Wade, sliding it into a paper evidence bag instead of plastic, the way I'd later learn actual detectives do it instead of the way television always shows. He asked us a dozen questions about exactly where we'd found it and how long the barking had been going on, writing everything down in a small spiral notebook with a stub of a pencil that looked older than Tyler. Then he asked if he could use our kitchen table and an outlet for a few minutes, pulled a laptop and a card reader out of his bag, and slid the little memory card out of the camera's slot with 2 gloved fingers. I want to see it first, he said, not unkindly, when I asked if I could look too. Sometimes it's better if I go through it before family does. You can trust me on that. We stood around him anyway. I couldn't have walked away from that table if the house had caught fire. He plugged the card in. A folder appeared on the screen, dozens of files inside it, sorted by date and time. His finger hovered over the first one. Sienna, he said, glancing up at me before he clicked it open, in the voice of a man who already suspected something and was trying to decide how much to prepare me for it. I need you to know something before I open this. That camera's not new. The battery compartment's got a manufacturing sticker on it. This unit's almost 5 years old. I didn't understand yet what that meant. I understood it about 90 seconds later, and it split my entire understanding of the last 2.5 years of my life directly down the middle. He clicked the first file open. A still image filled the screen, time-stamped, grainy in the particular green-tinted way of night vision. It took me a second to recognize what I was looking at. Our old house, not my father's house. The house on Blake Avenue in Columbus. The 2-bedroom I'd shared with Marin before Damien. The one I'd moved out of the September I moved in with him. That's not my parents' house, I said. That's an apartment I lived in years ago. Alvarez clicked through 3 more images without a word. Same location, different nights, different weeks. A man's shape crossing the frame once, hood up, face turned away, at 2 a.m. On a Tuesday in a month I recognized instantly, because it was 3 weeks before Damien and I had our first official date. The night he supposedly ran into me outside a coffee shop 2 blocks from that apartment, an encounter he'd always described to friends and family as fate. My mother made a small sound behind me that I've never been able to fully describe since. He was watching you before you 2 even met, Alvarez said quietly. Or watching that address at least. I need to check something. He opened a second folder. Older files, a different date range entirely, going back almost 5 years. A different house appeared on the screen this time. A brick ranch somewhere with a chain link fence and a swing set visible in one corner of the yard. A young woman crossing the frame in several stills, dark-haired, maybe mid-20s, carrying grocery bags, walking a small dog, utterly unaware she was being cataloged from a tree line the way deer get cataloged before hunting season. Who is that? I heard myself ask, though some part of me already knew the shape of the answer even before I had the words for it. Alvarez didn't answer right away. He was scrolling through something else on his own laptop now, a database I couldn't see the details of, his face going very still and very focused in the particular way of a man who has just watched 2 separate case files slide together into one. Her name's Kayla Mercer, he said finally. There's an open missing persons flag on her from a jurisdiction 2 counties over, filed by her mother in 2021. Never closed, never any activity on it since. He looked up at me. You ever hear that name before, Sienna? I had to sit down. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. No, I said. I mean, once. He mentioned an ex-fiancé named Kayla years ago. He said she was unstable, that she made things up about him. I never asked more. I didn't think I needed to. Alvarez nodded slowly, like a piece had just locked into place that he'd been carrying around unfinished for a long time. Kayla Mercer was engaged to a man named Damien Cole in 2019, he said. Her mother reported her missing in March of 2021, 3 months after Kayla told her she was, quote, moving to Arizona for a fresh start and didn't want contact for a while. Mother never heard from her again. Case went cold within the year. No body. No confirmed sighting. working, just gone. He looked at the screen, then back at me. This camera has images of Kayla Mercer's old residence going back to early 2019, and images of your old apartment on Blake Avenue starting the spring before you two officially met. Same unit, same registration sticker on the housing. Whoever set this up used it on her first, and then used it on you. The room tilted a little. My father put a hand flat on the table like he needed it to stay upright. He's done this before, my mother said. Not a question, just the sentence landing in the room and refusing to leave. I need to make some calls, Alvarez said, already reaching for his phone. This just became a lot bigger than a restraining order violation. It took him 2 days to run the serial number stamped inside the camera's battery compartment through the manufacturer's warranty registration. It came back registered under the name Daniel Coleman, an alias close enough to Damian Cole that Alvarez said it was almost lazy, the kind of thing a man does when he's never once been made to answer for anything and has stopped bothering to be careful. The registration address traced to an apartment in Cincinnati Damian had lived in during 2019. The same year, Alvarez confirmed after 2 more calls to a detective in the neighboring county that Kayla Mercer had been reported missing from. Denise Mercer, Kayla's mother, called my father's landline 4 days after that, having been given our information by Alvarez with my permission, her voice shaking so hard at first that my father had to ask her to repeat herself twice. She told him she'd spent 3.5 years believing her daughter had simply chosen to cut her off, the way young women sometimes do after a bad breakup, needing space, needing distance, needing time. She told him she used to lie awake, convinced Kayla was living some quiet, private life somewhere warm, ignoring her calls out of spite rather than something worse. She told him that hearing there might finally be a real lead, even a devastating one, felt like being allowed to breathe after 3.5 years of holding it. I got on the phone with her myself that night. I don't fully remember what either of us said. I remember crying, and her crying, and the strange, terrible intimacy of 2 women who had never met discovering they'd both loved, in their own different ways, the same man who had methodically erased people from the world for the crime of trying to leave him. I remember her thanking me, of all things, for the camera being found at all, for giving investigators a real thread to pull after 3.5 years of nothing. Everything I thought I understood about my relationship reorganized itself around that phone call. Damian hadn't been a jealous man who lost control in isolated, forgivable moments. He was a man with a method, refined once already on someone before me, someone whose family still didn't know if she was alive. The wall punch on our anniversary, the slap in the parking garage, the choking, the threats detailing exactly how he'd kill my father first. None of it had been an accident of temper. It had been a rehearsal for a role he already knew how to play, because he'd played some version of it before, on a woman whose mother had been searching for her for 3.5 years with nothing to show for it but an unanswered missing persons file. I thought about the 2.5 years I'd spent making excuses for him, 2.5 years I'd spent believing on some level that I was the one thing making him this way, that my love or my patience or my willingness to keep trying could eventually be the thing that fixed whatever was broken in him. I understood now, sitting in my father's kitchen with Denise Mercer's voice still echoing in my ear, that there had never been anything for me to fix. There had only ever been something to survive. Alvarez told us, before he left that night with the camera and the memory card bagged and logged, that the restraining order violation charge was about to become the least of Damian Cole's problems. A warrant was already being drafted. Detectives in 2 counties were coordinating for the first time in 3.5 years. He told us to keep doing exactly what we'd been doing. Keep the cameras running. Keep the doors locked. Keep tight and close. Because a man who had just realized his past was catching up to him might do something desperate before anyone had the chance to arrest him for it. He was right. It took 11 days. Which brings the story back to that Saturday afternoon, to the gravel crunching under tires at 412, to 3 men standing on a porch with 3 barrels raised at a man whose hand had just disappeared inside his jacket. 3 seconds is a long time when nobody is breathing. Hands where we can see them, my father said. His voice didn't shake. I've thought about that a lot since. How a man who just learned his daughter's fiancé had likely killed or disappeared, another young woman could stand on his own porch and keep his voice that steady. 11 years in the Marine Corps does something to a person that I don't think ever fully leaves. Right now, Damian. Damian's hand came out slowly, empty at first, palms up, a performance of surrender that didn't reach his eyes. Then, in the same motion, something small and dark flashed in his fingers, and Wade's finger tightened on the trigger guard, and my mother screamed something from the upstairs window that none of us understood until it was already over. It was a folding knife, not drawn to attack. Drawn, we understood a half-second too late, to turn on himself, right there on my father's porch, in front of all of us. One last performance calculated to make sure that whatever happened next, I would be the one who had to live with it. Titan hit him before the blade cleared his pocket. 100 pounds of dog closing the distance in under 2 seconds, driving Damian sideways off the top step and into the dirt hard enough to knock the knife clean out of his hand. Tyler was on him next, knee in his back, shotgun tossed aside onto the porch boards, both hands pinning Damian's wrist before he could reach for anything else. My father never lowered his pistol the entire time, standing over both of them, and Wade was already shouting into his phone that we needed police and an ambulance. Now. Both. Right now. Damian screamed into the dirt, not in pain, in fury, the mask gone completely now. Nothing left underneath it but the thing that had had always been there. "You did this," he shouted, twisting his head to find me where I stood frozen in the doorway. "You made me do this. I loved you. I would have given you everything." I made myself walk out onto that porch. My legs didn't want to hold me, but I made them anyway, because I understood, standing there, that this was the last time in my life I was ever going to speak to this man, and I wasn't going to let him have the last word in it. "You didn't love me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You loved having me. There's a difference, and it took me 2.5 years to learn it, and I'm never going to unlearn it again." I looked past him, at Tyler kneeling on his back, at my father's steady hands. "Her name was Kayla Mercer. Her mother has been looking for her for 3.5 years. You're going to tell them where she is." Something in his face changed then, and it wasn't guilt. It was calculation, fast and cold. The sound of a man realizing the story he'd told himself about his own life had just been read out loud by someone else, in front of witnesses, and there was no version of tonight where he got to write the ending anymore. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, and even Tyler, kneeling on his back with a stranger's full weight pinning him to the dirt, let out a short, disgusted breath at how easily the lie came, even now, even here. The sheriff's cars came up the driveway 2 minutes later, followed almost immediately by an ambulance, followed less than 20 minutes after that by Sergeant Alvarez himself, who'd apparently been 30 minutes away running down a lead when the call came through and broke every speed limit between there and my father's house to make it in time. He was the one who read Damien his rights, the one who cuffed him properly while paramedics checked the scratch marks Titan had left along his forearm, the one who looked at me across the yard with an expression I can only describe as grim relief. "We'll get it out of him," he told me quietly, once Damien was in the back of a patrol car, once the porch had gone quiet except for Titan's low, satisfied growl, and my mother's footsteps finally coming down the stairs. Men like this always think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. Eventually, that catches up with them too. It took 3 more weeks, and a plea deal his own lawyer pushed him toward once the digital evidence from the camera and 2 separate case files made the outcome obvious to everyone but Damien himself. But eventually he told them, Kayla Mercer wasn't dead. She was alive, living under a name that wasn't her own in a small town outside Reno, having fled there in 2021 with nothing but a duffel bag and a fear so total she'd been too afraid to ever contact her own mother again, terrified that any trace of her would lead him straight back to her door. Damien hadn't killed her. He'd simply made her so afraid of what he'd do if he ever found her that she'd erased herself instead, the same way I understood with a chill that never fully left me. I might have eventually erased myself too if that camera hadn't been sitting in a tree line 3 weeks before he ever got the chance to try again. The weeks after the arrest were their own kind of chaos, quieter than the porch, but in some ways harder to live through, because there was no adrenaline left to carry me through it, just the slow, grinding work of unmaking a life I'd spent 2.5 years building around another person. The wedding venue, a barn outside Granville we'd booked the previous summer, kept our $3,200 deposit, non-refundable. The contract had said so in print I'd skimmed past the day we signed it giddy, and certain we'd never need to read that clause closely. I called them myself on a Tuesday, and said the words, "The wedding's off," out loud for the first time to a stranger on the phone, and something about saying it to someone who had no context for any of it, who just said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. I'll process the cancellation," made it feel more real than saying it to my own family ever had. The joint account took longer. Huntington Bank required both signatures to formally dissolve it, and Damien, even from a county jail cell awaiting trial, found a way through his lawyer to drag the process out for 6 weeks out of what I can only assume was spite, since there was nothing left in it for him to actually win. My father drove me to 3 separate meetings with a lawyer of our own before it was finally settled, and I walked away with $9,100 of the $14,600 I'd originally put in, the difference eaten by 3 months of a spending allowance and closure fees I'd never once questioned closely enough at the time. Family lines drew themselves in ways I hadn't expected. Damien's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia I'd met exactly twice in 2.5 years, called me 3 weeks after the arrest, crying so hard I could barely make out her first few sentences. She told me she'd suspected something was wrong with her son for a long time, that she'd seen glimpses of the same emptiness in him as a teenager that I'd learned to recognize as an adult, that she'd never had proof of anything, and had told herself, the way I once told myself, that surely it wasn't as bad as it looked. She apologized for things that weren't hers to apologize for. I found myself comforting her anyway, because grief doesn't check whose fault anything is before it arrives, and because some small, stubborn part of me understood that she had lost a son to whatever he'd become, the same way Denise Mercer had spent 3.5 years grieving a daughter who, thank God, had turned out to still be alive. Damien's father was a different story entirely. He called my father twice, the first time demanding to know why we were trying to ruin his son's life over some old rumor. The second time, a week later, offering astonishingly to pay for my silence, a number he never got to finish saying out loud before my father hung up on him. That was the last we heard from him. I understand now that some people would rather protect the shape of a story than face what's actually inside it, and I've stopped expecting differently from people who've spent a lifetime choosing comfort over truth. Marin reached out again in May, 3 weeks after the arrest made the local news. A short article that didn't name me, but named enough details that anyone who knew us both could put it together. Her text just said, "I saw. I'm so sorry. I'm here whenever you're ready. No No pressure. I just miss you. I cried reading it in my father's kitchen for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to answer. We met for coffee 2 weeks later, and it felt like meeting a friend across a canyon I'd spent 2.5 years digging without meaning to, wide and awkward and slow to cross, but crossable it turned out once I was finally willing to try. Denise Mercer called every few weeks that summer, mostly to talk, sometimes to update me on Kayla, who'd agreed cautiously to speak with investigators once she understood Damien was in custody and couldn't reach her. Kayla and I spoke on the phone for the first time in July, two women who'd loved and feared the same man 3 years apart, comparing notes we never should have needed to compare, and there was a strange, sad comfort in it that I still don't have a clean word for. She told me she was in therapy twice a week. She told me she'd started using her real name again for the first time in 3.5 years, slowly, carefully. First with her therapist, then with her mother, then, eventually, with a small circle of new friends who had no idea what she'd survived to end up sitting across from them at a diner counter in Reno. I told her I understood exactly what that kind of slow reclaiming felt like, because I was doing my own version of it 2 states away. There were nights that summer I sat on my father's back porch, Titan's head heavy in my lap, and let myself grieve the version of my life I genuinely believed I was building. Not Damien. Never Damien, not really. I grieved the version of myself who still believed, 4 months into a relationship, that being remembered was the same thing as being loved. I grieved the wedding I'd planned in a notebook I eventually threw away, rather than keep looking at. I grieved 2.5 years I couldn't get back, the friendships that had gone quiet, the visits home I'd canceled, the version of my 20s I'd spent making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger standing next to me. Some losses don't come with a villain standing in front of you to be angry at in the moment they happen. They just accumulate, quietly, until one day you look up and understand how much of yourself you spent without ever once being asked to. Damien took a plea deal in September rather than face trial on charges that had grown by then to include the restraining order violations, the assault from the year before, and enough of what investigators pieced together about Kayla's disappearance to charge him with false imprisonment and interstate stalking, even without her willing to testify about certain parts of it herself. He's serving 11 years. Denise Mercer sat 2 rows behind me at the sentencing hearing, and when the judge read the number out loud, she reached forward and took my hand without either of us saying a word about it first. I gave a victim impact statement before the sentence came down, 4 pages I'd rewritten a dozen times at my father's kitchen table, crossing out every line that sounded too much like begging for sympathy and keeping only the ones that simply told the truth. I told the court about the wall he punched through 6 inches from my head in the first year, back when I still believed his crying afterward meant something real. I told them about the $200 a week and the receipts. I told them about the trail camera zip-tied to a tree, aimed at my mother's kitchen window, running for weeks before a dog's instincts caught what 4 adult humans had missed. Damien sat at the defense table the entire time, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, and he never once looked directly at me while I spoke, which told me, more clearly than anything the judge said afterward, that some part of him already understood exactly what he'd done, and simply couldn't stand to watch it be said out loud in front of people who now knew the truth of it too. He tried to reach me twice more before the trial date was set, both times through letters mailed from the county facility, the first one 3 pages long, alternating between apology and blame in a way I recognized immediately from 2.5 years of listening to him do exactly that in person. He wrote that he'd never really meant any of it, that I'd pushed him further than any person should be pushed, that he still loved me and always would, that a real family forgives. I read the first letter twice before I understood what I was looking at. I read the second one, which arrived in August, exactly once, saw the first line was another variation on the same theme, and handed it directly to my father, who handed it to Alvarez without either of us discussing it first. There was no third letter. I don't know if that was a rule someone enforced on his end, or a decision he made himself once he understood, finally, that nothing he wrote was ever going to land the way he needed it to anymore. The logistics of untangling a life took longer than I expected in almost every direction. I had to change my phone number twice, once immediately after the arrest, and once again in June when a number I didn't recognize started texting variations of things only Damien could have known, routed, investigators eventually confirmed, through a cellmate running a phone in violation of a dozen different jail policies. I had to formally withdraw from a joint lease Damien and I had signed for an apartment we were supposed to move into after the wedding, a process that took 4 phone calls and a letter from my lawyer before the property management company would release me from a contract with his name still on it. I had to sit through 2 separate depositions that summer, one for the assault case, one for the interstate stalking charge, answering questions about the worst 2.5 years of my life to lawyers who were, at least, gentler about it than I'd braced myself for. My father hired a private investigator for exactly 1 week that June, before Alvarez asked him, politely but firmly, to stand down and let the department's own investigation run its course without a civilian complicating the evidence trail. My father agreed, reluctantly, the same way a man agrees to something he still privately intends to override if it stops working fast enough. It never came to that. The case moved fast enough on its own once 2 counties finally started talking to each other, and I think my father needed those 7 days more for himself than for the investigation, needed to feel like he was doing something with his hands instead of just standing guard squared on a porch waiting for the next terrible thing to arrive. By August, the fortress my family had built around that house started, very slowly, to soften back into just being a house again. The motion lights stayed up. Wade never took those down, said there was no reason to, but the nightly ritual of strapping on a pistol before bed quietly stopped sometime in late July. Nobody announcing it, everyone just noticing eventually that it had been days, then a week, since anyone had done it. Titan still barked at the tree line, sometimes out of habit, and every single time, for months afterward, all four of us would freeze for half a second before remembering there was nothing out there anymore. No reason left for the sound to mean anything except a dog doing what dogs do. Damien's lawyer made one final move that August, 3 weeks before the plea deal was finalized, that told me more about the man I'd almost married than almost anything else in the entire ordeal. He reached out through my own attorney with what he called a proposed civil settlement, $40,000, contingent on my agreeing to decline any further cooperation with investigators on the interstate stalking charge tied to Kayla's case, framed in the paperwork as compensation for emotional distress, rather than what it actually was, which was an attempt to buy his way out of the part of the case that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with a woman he'd already hurt worse than I ever knew. My lawyer told me I didn't have to decide right away, that plenty of people in my position would take the money and walk away with a clean conscience about it. I didn't need the time. I called her back the next morning and told her to reject it, in writing, on the record. $40,000 would have covered every dollar I'd lost between the venue deposit and the joint account, several times over, with plenty left besides. It didn't matter. Some things aren't for sale, and my silence about what he'd done to Kayla Mercer, a woman who deserved better than being reduced to a bargaining chip one more time by the same man who'd already taken 3.5 years of her life, was never going to be one of the things I'd let him buy. My coworkers at the practice found out gradually, the way news like that always travels. First through the local article nobody could quite confirm was about me, then through a slip from one of the dental assistants who'd seen the arrest report because her cousin worked at the sheriff's office. I braced myself for the awkwardness of it, the sideways looks, the careful, overly gentle way people sometimes treat you once they know. Instead, my office manager, a woman named Barb who'd worked there longer than I'd been alive, called me into her office one Monday, closed the door, and told me flatly that my job would be there whenever I was ready. Full stop, no conditions, no timeline. The two hygienists I worked closest with started a group text that summer that had nothing to do with Damien at all, just recipes and dog photos and complaints about difficult patients, an ordinary, unremarkable kindness that meant more to me that summer than almost anything else did. There were harder days too, plenty of them. A woman I barely knew from the neighborhood asked me, at a gas station in June, in a tone that pretended at concern while asking something closer to gossip, whether it was true I'd known all along and just hadn't wanted to cause trouble for my family. I sat in my car afterward for 10 minutes before I could drive, hands gripping the wheel, furious in a way I didn't fully have words for at the time. I understand that fury better now. People want abuse to announce itself clearly, want the victim to have seen it coming from a mile away so they can quietly reassure themselves it could never happen to them. It rarely works that way. It didn't for me, and it didn't for Kayla either, and neither of us owed anyone at a gas station an explanation for surviving something slowly enough that it took us both years to see it clearly. In the same bedroom I grew up sleeping in as a teenager, and for a long time I thought that would feel like failure, moving backward instead of forward at 27. It doesn't feel that way anymore. I go back to Columbus 3 days a week for work. The practice on High Street kept my position open the entire time I was gone, and I drive the 2 hours home each of those nights, instead of finding an apartment of my own. Not because I'm afraid to, though some of that's probably still true, but because I've come to understand that the version of independence I used to chase, the one where nobody got to have an opinion about who I let into my life, was never actually freedom. It was just isolation with better lighting. I'm saving toward a place of my own now, a real one, on my own timeline, and I've started, slowly, letting my father read the listings with me on Sunday afternoons, instead of hiding them from him the way I once hid almost everything else. Wade got married himself last spring, to a woman named Priya he'd been dating quietly for 2 years, and I stood up at that wedding as a bridesmaid in a pale green dress, and cried through half the ceremony for reasons that had very little to do with the actual bride and groom. Tyler still works at my father's shop, still keeps Titan at his place most nights, though the dog seems to split his time fairly evenly between both houses now, welcome everywhere, which feels like exactly the right ending for the one member of our family who never once needed convincing about who to trust. Kayla and I talk most weeks now. She came out to Ohio for a visit last October, stood in my father's kitchen where Alvarez once opened a laptop and split both our lives in half, and we didn't need to say very much to each other about any of it, because there's a particular kind of understanding that doesn't require narration between two people who've survived the same specific shape of harm. She's using her full name again everywhere now, not just with people close to her. She started a small graphic design business under it this spring. Denise flew out with her, and the two of them stayed with my parents for 4 days, and my mother cooked more food than any of us could possibly eat and cried twice doing it, and I understood, watching her, that grief and gratitude had gotten so tangled together in our family by then that we'd mostly stopped trying to separate them out. I started seeing someone new in the spring, a physical therapist named Owen I I met through Marin, slow and easy in a way that used to frighten me, and now most days just feels like relief. He knows the whole story. I told him early on purpose, not as a test exactly, but close to one, because I needed to know before I let myself feel anything real, whether he was the kind of man who'd lean in when things got heavy, or the kind who'd quietly start finding reasons to disappear. He leaned in. He asked good questions and didn't try to fix anything that wasn't his to fix. And when I finally introduced him to my father shook his hand for a long moment, studying his face the way he studies a piece of furniture, before deciding whether it's worth restoring, and then nodded once, which from my father is close to a benediction. I go to therapy every other week in Columbus with a woman named Dr. Reyes who specializes in exactly what happened to me, and I've learned language there I didn't have before. Coercive control, trauma bonding, the specific mechanics of how a person convinces you, slowly, that the walls closing in around you are actually just the shape of love. I don't say any of that to excuse the 2.5 years I spent making myself smaller. I say it because understanding the mechanics of what happened to me was the only way I found to stop carrying it like it was somehow my fault for not seeing it sooner. Dr. Reyes told me once, early on, that the smartest, strongest people she'd ever counseled were the ones who'd survived exactly this, because it takes a particular kind of intelligence to adapt yourself so completely to a threat you can't outrun any other way. I didn't believe her the first time she said it. Some days I still have to talk myself back into believing it now, but it gets easier, a little, every time. Here's what I understand now that I didn't understand at 24, standing in a wine bar in the short north, flattered that a stranger remembered how I took my coffee. Love that requires your isolation isn't love. It's containment wearing love's clothes. And the two can look identical for a long time if you've never been shown the difference. I spent 2.5 years believing that protecting the people I loved meant keeping them away from the parts of my life that had gone dark, when the truth was the opposite the entire time. The people who loved me were never the danger. They were the only reason I'm still here to tell you this. I begged my family to never speak to me again. Once, in a phone call I still remember every word of, certain that my silence was the only gift I had left to give them. My father refused. He didn't argue with me or lecture me. He just said quietly that he wasn't going anywhere, that I could call him every single day or not at all for a year, and he'd still be standing on that porch waiting the moment I decided to come home. I didn't understand yet, that day, how literally he meant it. I understand it now every time I watch him check the locks before bed. An old habit from a danger that's finally actually gone, done now more out of care than fear. I won't pretend this story ends with everything intact. Kayla lost 3.5 years of her life to hiding from a man who never should have had that kind of power over anyone. Denise lost 3.5 years she'll never get back. Birthdays and phone calls and ordinary Tuesdays she spent instead believing her daughter had simply chosen to vanish. I lost a version of my 20s I can't get back either. The trusting, unguarded version of myself who used to believe the best about people by default instead of by evidence. Some of what was taken from all three of us isn't coming back, no matter how the sentencing hearing ended or how good my life looks now from the outside. But I have my family back, whole, the way I never should have let myself lose them in the first place. I have a dog who still barks at nothing sometimes, and a father who still checks the locks, and a mother who still calls twice a week just to hear my voice, and 2 brothers who taught me, without ever meaning to turn it into a lesson, what it actually looks like when someone means it when they say they'd stand between you and anything in the world that tried to hurt you. That's the whole story now, not the fairy tale I thought I was walking into at a wine bar 3 years ago, and not the nightmare I lived through either, not anymore. Just a woman, 27 years old, sitting on her father's porch some evenings with a dog's head heavy in her lap, grateful and grieving, and finally safe. Both of those things true at exactly the same time.